America has always been an unrestful union. We are a nation founded by revolt, and the unrest hasn't stopped since. This series is going to take a look into incidents of unrest, big and small, to provide context for what's happening today. My goal is to detail the incident, how the government handled the situation, and what the after effects were. Now, we take a look at how unrest has changed, and stayed the same, throughout American history. The Revolutionary War and the peace that followed were a tumultuous time for the young United States. The country was trying to get its bearings and make their experimental form of government work. As a result, these years were fraught with those who questioned the government's authority and rose up against it. There were several mutinies, a notable one being in Pennsylvania in 1781, racial violence, and tax revolts, as the new government grappled with financial problems. Once the Revolutionary War ended, and the government's authority solidified, mutinies became less common, and tax revolts ceased to occur. The racial violence, however, only increased going into the 19th century. This was due, in part, to a rapid increase in immigration, causing fighting between the newly arrived immigrants and those already here. The states also fought amongst themselves over their borders, and the newly formed state of California, being unable to stop crime, had several vigilante movements that led to the deaths of hundreds. As the Civil War approached, there were many pro- and anti-abolitionist riots, ultimately culminating in the Civil War. All was not well on the home fronts of both sides. The Union had to deal with draft riots, and the Confederacy had bread riots. The end of this war, however, wasn't the end of the fighting. The Republican Party's attempt to reconstruct the South provoked the Democrats into racial and political unrest, one such incident being the Colfax Massacre. The Gilded Age that followed Reconstruction saw rapid economic growth and terrible working conditions. This sparked unrest among the workers, which culminated in the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, and this was the beginning of labor unrest that continues to this day. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the racial and labor unrest continued. The onset of World War I saw a brief reprieve in unrest as the country united to fight the Germans, but things got much worse after the war. This is when the Red Summer, a wave of violence perpetrated against blacks, took place alongside many strikes. Both of these events were made worse by the first Red Scare. As we enter the good times of the Roaring Twenties, the labor and racial unrest continues, with the labor unrest getting much worse moving into the Great Depression. One notable incident here being the Bonus Army's March on Washington, D.C. As the Second World War kicked off, just like with the First, America united and the unrest died down. And just like with the First, there was a huge increase in unrest during the post-war period, culminating in the Civil Rights Movement of the early 1960s. As America increased its involvement in the Vietnam War, through the mid to late 60s, a draft was declared leading to anti-draft riots, which bear a striking similarity to the draft riots of the Civil War. Moving into the 80s and 90s, racial violence quieted down and revolved around the actions of police, the most prominent of these being the Rodney King riots in LA. The American tradition of being unhappy with the status quo has continued into the 21st century, which has seen unrest related to police action, racial tensions, labor issues, and economic and foreign policy. The largest events of this period being protests sparked by the economic crash in 2008 and the rioting over the death of George Floyd. I would like to start off by saying this is not going to be a chronological series. I am a weirdo who does research in his free time, and I thought I would share my findings with the world. I started this research to see if we were living in exceptional times. I hear talk of how it's never been this bad before, the country's disintegrating, and the possibility of a civil war. But from what I can tell, we are no more unrestful than the day we declared our independence. The only difference, in my opinion, is the rate information is disseminated. What we have now is the ability to see these events while they're happening, so I want to provide context for the unrest of today by showing what this country has gone through in the past. I am very passionate about this and excited to embark on this endeavor. If you would like to assist me in expanding perspectives, I ask you to donate using Patreon, PayPal, and my GoFundMe to help me increase the quality of my content and access information that is behind paywalls. All links are in the description. I look forward to seeing you in the episodes to come.